Have you ever noticed that the more aware you become of the world and of your own mind, the lonelier you begin to feel? It's not the usual kind of loneliness, the one we experience when we're physically alone. It's a peculiar kind of isolation that arises precisely when we start to see beyond the collective illusions that keep society functioning. It's as if, by awakening to certain realities, you inadvertently distance yourself from the shared dream that connects most people. This phenomenon is becoming increasingly common in our age of hyperinformation and superficial hyperconnection. People who develop a deeper awareness of themselves, of the systems that govern us, and of the narratives that shape our lives, often find themselves in self-imposed silence, unable to genuinely communicate their deepest perceptions and concerns. This silence is not a casual choice, but an almost inevitable response to the dissonance between what they see and what they can express in today's social environment. For thousands of years, human beings lived in small communities where isolation was practically impossible. We were social animals not only by choice, but by absolute necessity for survival. Our species evolved to depend deeply on cooperation and constant communication. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors rarely experienced moments of true solitude. Physical isolation was often a death sentence. More importantly, mental or existential isolation was virtually unknown since we shared the same myths, gods, and understandings of the world. The perception of reality was a collective phenomenon, not an individual one. The great questions about the meaning of life, the purpose of human existence, and our place in the cosmos were answered by shared narratives that united the members of the tribe in a common understanding of reality. Even when someone disagreed or saw something different, the scope of that divergence was limited and occurred within a broadly shared conceptual framework. What we see today is an unprecedented phenomenon in human history. For the first time, we are creating the conditions for a kind of isolation that is not physical, but deeply cognitive and existential. This happens precisely as we become more technologically connected. At first glance, it seems like a paradox. We have never been so connected, and yet existential isolation has never been so pronounced. But this paradox begins to make sense when we understand that technological connection and genuine communication are not necessarily the same thing. In fact, in many cases, they are in direct opposition. The very technology that supposedly brings us closer often creates the ideal conditions for a new kind of distance. The information revolution, which promised to democratize knowledge and unite humanity, has generated an unprecedented fragmentation of collective consciousness. Today, we no longer share a single narrative about the world, not even within the same society. Instead, we inhabit radically different informational universes customized by algorithmic preferences. Even when two people talk about the same event, they are often referring to completely distinct perceptual realities. What is considered a fact by one person is often seen as misinformation by another. In this environment, the person who develops a broader and more critical view, one who tries to see beyond algorithms and echo chambers, often finds themselves in a cognitive no man's land with no real companionship. Consider what happens when someone begins to study deeply the economic, political, and media systems that structure our everyday reality. The more they understand the hidden interests, the manipulations of perception, and the collective illusions that keep these systems running, the less capable they become of comfortably participating in everyday conversations about politics, consumption, or the news of the day. They realize that most of these conversations take place within narrowly defined parameters that rarely touch on truly meaningful issues, yet trying to introduce these deeper perceptions into casual conversations often leads to disastrous results: social discomfort, rejection, or simply the feeling of not being understood. This phenomenon is not new. Throughout history, philosophers and mystics have often described a similar sense of alienation after experiences of deep understanding. Plato's allegory of the cave illustrates precisely this dilemma. The man who returns to the cave after seeing the outside world can no longer genuinely share in the reality perceived by those who never left. The crucial difference is that today, this phenomenon is no longer limited to a few exceptional individuals. It is becoming an increasingly common experience, affecting millions of people who, thanks to access to information and time for reflection, are developing levels of awareness that isolate them from conventional narratives. What makes this isolation particularly painful is that it contradicts our biological nature. We evolved to seek connection and shared understanding. Our psychological well-being depends heavily on being understood by others. When that understanding becomes impossible due to fundamental differences in perception of reality, we experience a kind of suffering for which we are not evolutionarily prepared. It's as if our minds have evolved faster than our emotional capacity to deal with the consequences of that evolution. Some might argue that the solution would simply be to find other equally conscious people to share perceptions with. In theory, that makes sense, but in practice, it's extraordinarily difficult. First, because such people are often geographically scattered, and even when connected digitally, communication mediated by screens rarely satisfies our biological need for genuine connection. Second, because even among highly conscious individuals, specific perceptions and understandings can vary drastically, creating new forms of isolation. And third, because these people have often developed psychological defense mechanisms that make it difficult to open up enough for true connection. Technology, which theoretically could help overcome these barriers, often intensifies them. Social media platforms, for example, are designed to maximize engagement, not understanding. They thrive on polarization and oversimplification, precisely the opposite of what conscious individuals seek. Digital communication tends to reduce our interactions to exchanges of information, when what we truly crave is a deeper resonance of understanding. We are trading quantity for quality, connection for real presence, and dialogue for parallel monologues. I need to pause for a moment and ask you directly, what aspect of this technological future we are discussing stirs your fear or apprehension the most? Do you lie awake at night thinking about it too? I know that many times we keep these concerns to ourselves, perhaps out of fear of sounding paranoid or technophobic in a world that celebrates every new innovation without question. But your concerns are valid and probably shared by more people than you realize. Share in the comments. My biggest fear about our technological future is your voice might help create a space where we can honestly discuss these collective fears instead of suppressing them. And perhaps by naming these fears together, we can begin to imagine ways to face them. There is also a neurological dimension to this phenomenon that is rarely discussed. Our brains did not evolve to process the amount of information we are exposed to daily, nor to understand systems as complex as those that now govern our lives. When a person truly tries to comprehend the interconnection between global financial systems, climate dynamics, political power structures, and emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, they are demanding from their brain a kind of processing for which it was not biologically optimized. The result is often cognitive overload that can manifest as anxiety, depression, or a persistent sense of displacement. Paradoxically, the more we understand about the world, the less adapted we feel to live in it. History shows us that periods of rapid technological and social transformation often generate crises of meaning. During the Industrial Revolution, for example, movements like Romanticism emerged partly as a response to the existential displacement caused by mechanization and urbanization. Today, we are experiencing even deeper and faster transformations, but without equally powerful cultural movements to help us process and integrate these changes. Instead, we have a culture of permanent distraction that encourages us to avoid precisely the kind of deep reflection necessary to find meaning amid chaos. A particularly troubling aspect of this conscious isolation is that it often leads to a kind of cynicism or hopelessness. When a person realizes the magnitude of the problems we face as a species, the apparent impossibility of effectively communicating these perceptions, and the inertia of the systems that would need to change, the natural conclusion may be that there is no possible way out. This is a real and dangerous risk. Awareness without hope can become an even lonelier prison than the comfortable unawareness most people prefer. However, history also teaches us that all great social transformations began with isolated individuals who kept the flame of a different perception alive, even when they seemed to be alone. Consider figures like Galileo, whose insights about the cosmos so radically contradicted the consensus of his time that they led him into forced isolation, yet eventually transformed our understanding of the universe. Or consider the early abolitionists, who were initially solitary voices against an institution that most considered natural and permanent. These examples suggest that conscious isolation, though painful, can be a necessary stage in a broader process of social and cognitive transformation. Perhaps we are experiencing what could be called evolutionary dissonance, a mismatch between the development of our consciousness and the social, technological, and communicative structures we have inherited. Our capacity for understanding has outgrown our ability to build social systems that can accommodate and nurture that understanding. It is as if we are developing wings while still trapped in cages designed for terrestrial creatures. The discomfort we feel is not a sign that something is wrong with us, but an indicator that we are in a transitional stage of cultural and cognitive evolution. There is also a central paradox in this phenomenon. The expanded consciousness that isolates us is also our only hope for creating more authentic bridges. Only through a deep understanding of ourselves, of others, and of the systems that connect us can we begin to imagine and build new modes of communication and community that can overcome current limitations. Conscious isolation, seen from this perspective, is not a final state, but a necessary stage in a broader journey toward more evolved forms of human connection. This brings us to a crucial question. How can we transform conscious isolation from a lonely prison into a catalyst for new forms of community? How can we create spaces, both physical and digital, where depth of perception is not an obstacle to connection, but its foundation? These are not merely theoretical questions, but practical and urgent challenges we face as individuals and as a species. A promising approach comes from intentional communities and movements that are actively experimenting with new forms of social organization based on principles of expanded consciousness. These range from sustainable living communities to digital platforms designed to foster deeper and more substantive conversations. What these initiatives have in common is the recognition that we need to fundamentally redesign our social and communicative spaces to accommodate higher levels of consciousness and complexity. At the same time, we need to develop new languages and conceptual models that can facilitate communication between different levels and types of consciousness. At present, we lack a shared vocabulary to discuss many of the deeper insights that emerge from expanded awareness. This creates unnecessary barriers, even among people who could potentially understand one another. Developing this vocabulary is both an intellectual challenge and a social imperative. On an individual level, those who experience conscious isolation may benefit from developing a practice of compassionate presence even amid cognitive dissonance. This means cultivating the ability to be fully present with others without demanding complete understanding or agreement. Paradoxically, this ability to be present without expectations often opens space for more genuine connections than more direct attempts to communicate complex perceptions. It is also important to recognize that consciousness is not a binary state, but a continuous and multidimensional spectrum. Each of us has areas of greater and lesser awareness, blind spots, and unique insights. Recognizing this allows us to approach others with humility and genuine curiosity, even when they seem to operate from a more limited perspective in certain dimensions. Perhaps the greatest challenge we face is not how to escape conscious isolation, but how to transform it into a different kind of community, one based not on the illusion of complete understanding, but on the mutual recognition of our essential complexity. This would require a revolution not only in our communication technologies, but in our fundamental understanding of what it means to be human and to be in relationship with other humans. There is a tendency in our culture to pathologize existential discomfort, treating it as an individual dysfunction to be corrected with medication or self-optimization techniques. But what if the discomfort many of us feel is not a defect, but an appropriate response to a world that has become profoundly dysfunctional on many levels? What if our sense of alienation is actually an indicator of psychological health, a sign that we have not yet completely lost our ability to discern the authentic from the artificial, the meaningful from the trivial? Seen from this perspective, the sense of isolation that accompanies expanded consciousness can be understood not as a failure of adaptation, but as a refusal to adapt to what no longer serves our evolution as a species. It is an expression of what we might call cognitive integrity, the determination to remain faithful to reality as we perceive it, even when it puts us at odds with prevailing social consensuses. Perhaps the most significant aspect of this phenomenon of conscious isolation is that it is occurring on a global scale, transcending cultural, political, and geographic boundaries. In every corner of the planet, people are awakening to similar perceptions and facing similar challenges of communication and connection. This suggests that we are experiencing not merely individual crises of meaning, but a collective process of cognitive transformation whose implications for our future as a species are profound and not yet fully understood. This global awakening process is occurring in parallel with other existential crises, such as climate change, technological disruption, and geopolitical instability. It is no coincidence that all these phenomena are converging now. They are interconnected manifestations of a global system reaching the limits of its sustainability not only ecologically, but cognitively and emotionally. The isolation many feel is a symptom of this broader systemic crisis, but also potentially a portal to its resolution. Philosopher Thomas Kuhn described how scientific revolutions occur when anomalies that cannot be explained within the dominant paradigm accumulate to a breaking point, forcing the emergence of a new paradigm. Similarly, we may be living through a moment when experiential anomalies, perceptions that cannot be adequately communicated or integrated within existing social and communicative paradigms, are accumulating to a point where a new paradigm of consciousness and community becomes not only possible but necessary. In this context, each person who consciously experiences and navigates conscious isolation is contributing to the emergence of that new paradigm, even when they seem to be alone. Each attempt to articulate difficult perceptions, each effort to create more authentic connections, each moment of compassionate presence amid dissonance is a small but significant step toward a culture more capable of accommodating and nurturing higher levels of awareness. Writer Charles Eisenstein speaks of the space between stories, a time when an old collective story is dying, but a new one has not yet fully emerged to take its place. This intermediate space is characterized precisely by the kind of isolation and disorientation we are discussing. It is uncomfortable and sometimes terrifying, but also pregnant with possibilities that could not exist within the old story. Perhaps conscious isolation is a manifestation of this in-between space, not a permanent state, but a necessary passage towards something not yet fully imaginable. If this perspective is correct, then the question for those who experience conscious isolation is not how to return to the comfort of unconscious connection, but how to remain faithful to their perception while actively participating in the creation of new forms of conscious connection. This requires both courage and creativity, the willingness to inhabit difficult questions without rushing towards simplistic answers, and the determination to experiment with new ways of being in community, even when existing models seem inadequate. Ultimately, conscious isolation can be understood as a necessary aspect of what psychologist Carl Jung called the process of individuation, the journey toward becoming a fully realized and integrated human being. Jung recognized that this journey often involves periods of deep loneliness and alienation as the individual separates from collective identifications to discover deeper authenticity. What we are witnessing today may be a kind of collective individuation process in which ever larger segments of humanity are simultaneously undergoing this challenging but potentially liberating transformation. Seen from this perspective, The pain of conscious isolation is not something to be avoided or denied, but honored as an integral aspect of our collective evolution. It is through this pain, and not in spite of it, that new possibilities for connection and community may eventually emerge. As poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, we must not imagine that the great renewal occurs where we are alone, it happens where we are together. Perhaps the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity of our time is to find ways of being together that honor the depth and complexity of our individual perceptions, rather than demanding that we silence or simplify them. This would require a revolution not only in our communication technologies, but in our fundamental understanding of what it means to be human and to be in community with other humans. As more people awaken to higher levels of consciousness and face the isolation that often accompanies this awakening, the need for such a revolution becomes increasingly urgent. It is not merely a matter of individual psychological well-being, but of our collective ability to respond coherently to the existential challenges we face as a species. A world in which the most conscious people feel systematically isolated and unable to contribute fully is a world that is wasting its most precious resource, the emerging wisdom of expanded human consciousness. In essence, the phenomenon of conscious isolation can be seen as a call for a fundamental transformation in how we structure our society, our communications, and our communities. It is a reminder that our current modes of connection are not keeping pace with the evolution of our consciousness, and that we must create new ones that can, far from being just a problem to be solved, it is a portal to possibilities we are only beginning to imagine. If these reflections have touched something you have been feeling, but perhaps have not found words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we meet here to explore together the great questions that define our era and to seek not only understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us on this ongoing journey. Subscribe so that we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with more wisdom and purpose in a world that so often leaves us disoriented and divided. Perhaps the most important thing to remember is that as lonely as the path of expanded consciousness may sometimes seem, you are not truly alone. All over the world, others are going through similar transformations, asking similar questions, and seeking new forms of connection that can honor the depth of their insights. Together, even when physically apart, we are participating in one of the greatest adventures in human history, the conscious evolution of our species toward ways of being and living together that we are only beginning to imagine. It is a journey that requires courage, patience, and compassion, both for ourselves and for others. But it is also a journey that holds the promise of a more integrated, more conscious humanity, ultimately more capable of facing the extraordinary challenges and seizing the equally extraordinary opportunities of our unique moment in history. The problem of truth is that the truth, first of all, is costly, whereas fiction is very cheap. If you want to write a truthful history book about the Roman Empire, for instance,
you need to invest a lot of energy, time, money. You need to study Latin. You probably need to study Greek, ancient Greek. You need to do archaeological excavations and find these ancient, whether inscriptions or pottery or weapons, and analyze them. Very costly and difficult. To write a fictional story about the Roman Empire, very easy. You just write anything you want and it's there on the page or on the internet. The truth is often also very complicated because reality is complicated. You want to give a truthful explanation for why the Roman Republic fell or why the Roman Empire eventually fell. Very complicated. Whereas fiction can be made as simple as possible, and people tend to prefer simple explanations over complicated ones. And finally, the truth can be painful, unattractive. We often don't want to know the truth about ourselves, whether as individuals, which is why we go to therapy for many years to know the things we don't want to know about ourselves, and also on the level of entire nations. Each nation has its own dark episodes, its own skeletons or cemeteries in the closet that people don't want to know about. A politician that, in an election campaign would just tell people the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, is unlikely to win many votes. So in this competition between the truth, which is costly and complicated and sometimes painful, and fiction, which is cheap and simple and you can make it very attractive, fiction tends to win. And if you look at, the large-scale systems, networks in history, they are often built on fictions, not on the truth.
What do you have to say to democratic countries, where we also see a bombarding of information like this impacting the democracy?
Democracy, in essence, is a conversation between a large number of people, which has strong self-correcting mechanisms. You need to keep the conversation, and to have a conversation, you must have many voices. If there is only one voice which is allowed to be heard, this is not a conversation. This is a dictatorship. This is a monologue, a dictate. The other thing is, a country must have a self-correcting mechanism, especially for the government, that if the government make a mistake, there is an independent media, there are independent courts that can expose and correct the mistake of the government, and ultimately, there are free and fair elections in which the people can replace the government. As long as you have these mechanisms, democracies are safe. You can have different governments with this policy or that policy and experiment. As long as there are these checks and balances and the ultimate ability to replace the government, then the democracy is safe. The danger in every democracy, and this goes back thousands of years, in a democracy you give one person or one party the power for a limited duration, on condition they afterwards give it back to the people, and the people can make a different choice next time. The danger is, what if you give power to someone who then doesn't give it back? They use the power they have to take over the institutions, to rig the elections, to control the media, and then you can never replace them. That was always the big dangers in democracy. You can have strong institutions, but government ultimately is able to corrupt all these institutions. So people should make wise choices and be very careful not to give power to people who might not want to give it back.
For the first time in history, it is technically possible to annihilate privacy. If you think about authoritarian regimes, throughout history they always wanted to monitor their citizens around the clock. But this was technically impossible. Even in the Soviet Union, you have 200 million Soviet citizens. You can't follow them all the time because the KGB didn't have 200 million agents. And even if the KGB somehow got 200 million agents, that's not enough. In the Soviet Union, it's still basically paper bureaucracy, the secret police. If a secret agent followed you around 24 hours a day, at the end of the day, they write a paper report about you and send it to KGB headquarters in Moscow. So imagine, every day, KGB headquarters is flooded with 200 million paper reports. Now, to be useful for anything, somebody needs to read and analyze them. They can't do it. They don't have the analysts. Therefore, even in the Soviet Union, some level of privacy was still the default for most people.